Welcome to Radical Personal Finance. Today, I have something slightly different. We're going to have a roundtable discussion on basically what I think of as orders and structures of society, specifically related to wealth and wealthy people. We're going to discuss a concept of patronage. Now, this discussion you'll hear with the various callers that are on the line. This discussion is coming out of a discussion that many of us have been having in our private group as those who attended the Radical Personal Finance Family Camp. Our primary guest here today is Gregory Treat. Greg has appeared previously on Radical Personal Finance. He came to Family Camp and gave a presentation discussing how to build a family dynasty, how to build family governance over time, basically a family office that will endure. A couple of weeks ago in our private group for attendees of Family Camp, I shared some articles about the Great House. One of those articles I have previously shared on Radical Personal Finance from Johann Kurtz. It's episode 987 if you're interested in pausing this and going back and listening to that particular article. 987 was called Invest Your Money into Founding a Great House to Change the World. And so it seemed very germane, and it sparked a great conversation among us on the topic of patronage societies. And many of us have questions, many of us have comments, many of us are thinking about this. But the way that I myself am thinking about it is, how do we influence the future in a positive way, especially driven by those of us who have resources? So right now we have about 5 or 6 of us on the line. I'm going to let Greg Treat give us an introduction to patronage. I'm not going to run this as an interview. It's going to be a Q&A and a discussion among those of us who have been involved. So Greg, welcome back here to Radical Personal Finance. I'd love it if you just give us an introduction from your perspective.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Joshua. And it's always a pleasure. I have enjoyed this robust discussion over the past I think it's been a couple of weeks now that we've been keeping it going, which is a pretty amazing accomplishment. So I texted you a while ago that, I've never had this kind of sustained engagement by a bunch of high capacity people on these topics. So that's, I think, a really important thing to start with, which is there's something in the air about this great houses, patronage, family dynasty conversation that we're having as a society that really was not happening 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago. And so when we talk about patronage systems and how to build a great house, I think that's sort of the place to start. Is there's been a sense that what we have in our broader society is not working. And we're looking towards older structures that for whatever reason people didn't feel the need for in the 1980s or 1990s. There wasn't that sort of pressure to explore these ideas then, because there was a lot of things that were working rather well in our world. So the content of the article that you posted, which is a great place to start, I think, was basically asking the question: what would happen if you created the absolute simplest, easiest to administrate? I would note that it's so easy to administrate, you wouldn't even need any lawyers, which, as I mentioned in the chat, with more or less tongue in cheek, I would never recommend.
Of course not.
And I wouldn't recommend it for a variety of reasons, right? But people are, if we're having the discussion of, do I recommend just giving people essentially $6,000 a month or some purchasing power equivalent as we continue to go down the inflation wormhole? Is that what I would recommend? Well, of course not. Any competent attorney, estate planning or trust attorney, could give you a much better system, lower your risk, probably triple your outcomes, and so that's the framing that I would put on that. But it's a really interesting thought exercise because it's so simple, right? So I'll just kind of brief the article. The idea was, what would happen if you were hyper wealthy, billionaire, and you took a couple hundred people and you started giving them $6,000 a month, right? An extra 30 to 50K a year. An extra 80K a year. And you did that for a while, right? What would happen to that society over time if you had some basic incentives? Okay? Some basic demands of, hey, this is what I want you to do. Here's who I am. I have a moral code. If you're in, we've selected these people from the masses by some undisclosed process, but we have our pool of two to 300 seats. And if you're in the seat, you're comporting with the values that the community espouses, you get the money to help you in your quest to. I think one of the big things is have a big family. Seems to be the number one value that people that are interested in setting these systems up, and that's because we've had as a society a tremendous and dramatic drop in what's called the total fertility rate. I think you've mentioned that on your podcast on a number of occasions, right?
Yes.
That's something your audience is fairly familiar with. So this is seen as, hey, if we can just inject some money into people's lives, then it's going to help them. And I would say, I think my starting position is that our current defaults, like if your path is go to a normal high school, participate in extracurriculars, go to a regular college, and then try to get a W-2 job and climb the corporate ladder and maybe do some real estate on the side. I think that the obstacles to you climbing the property ladder and the corporate ladder are so extreme that even an inefficient patronage system like the $6,000 a month is a better option for you. Okay. Now, there are some challenges with systems like that. So we can get into that, and I'm sure that as we talk through the rest of this call, we'll get into that. But I think perhaps it would also be useful for me at this initial time to say what I think a patronage system is. Okay. And really, patronage is simply a system of virtue. It's trying to figure out how do we interact with one another virtuously. And there's a useful frame that I work with in this context of games of life versus games of death, or death games. So my definition of a death game is basically anything where losing the game means you would lose your life, your liberty, or your the pursuit of happiness, right? Which is I was raised Baptist, so I want everything to alliterate. So I would say life, liberty, or livelihood, or maybe life, liberty, and legacy. So if the game that you're playing, if losing that game means that you would lose your life, lose your liberty, or lose your livelihood, your ability to provide for your family, your ability to meet some of these kind of fundamental covenantal obligations, what we know about human nature is, barring strong pacifistic convictions, usually religious convictions, men will kill not to lose such games, right? That's a very reliable feature of human psychology, let's say. So what is the alternative? Is there an alternative, right? I mean, most of our world runs with death games where there is some kind of implied threat to your life, to your liberty, or to your ability to provide for your family and leave a legacy that governs everything. Now we have kind of these Rube Goldbergian legal structures that disintermediate the person making the decision from the violent or lethal effect in a bunch of very complex ways. But that doesn't change the fact that most workplaces run on fear, right? They are driven by, do what I tell you, otherwise I'm going to kick you out into some kind of outer darkness existence. You'll lose your job, you'll lose your house, you'll lose your wife, and then your life will be over even if we don't actually kill you. And you might die along the way. And I think from just a corporate culture perspective, what we have learned these past 50 years is that sort of fear-based culture, that sort of fear-based motivational structure does not incentivize good, high-level, virtuous, long-term thinking, even in a business context, right? Let alone in a family context. I mean, if all incentive structures are basically fear-based, do what I want, or I'm going to put you in this extreme position of fear and pain, then it would sort of be immoral to ever hire your children or economically interact with your children, because I mean, it's sort of immoral to put your kids into this kind of fear-based, pain-based system, this death game, right? So the question is there an alternative? And I would say, yes, there is. The alternative is a game of life. Now, games of life are basically where you're competing for honor. And the amazing thing about this is also a fairly reliable feature of human psychology, is humans will work really, really hard when they're competing for honor. They will work really, really hard for relatively minor improvements in lifestyle that are status driven, right? You don't need to always threaten. In fact, not only do you not need, I think what we've demonstrated in again, just the broader business corporate culture, is the highest level of performance is done by people who believe they have an honorable relationship with their employer, and they're competing with other honorable people in a game with bounded rules, right? They're not. It's not no holds barred. It's not total war. It's not, well, why wouldn't I cheat because I have to win? Otherwise, there's such a immoral stigma about losing, that losing is just this unthinkably bad thing, right? Where and that is basically the problem with fear-based incentive structures, is if somebody in a fear-based incentive structure thinks they're going to lose, they have no incentive not to cheat, right? This is a major problem in our corporate cultures. So I think that's the framework, and one of the big observations I would say about a game of life is it's not an individual game. Like, games of life, by definition, in order to have this honor-based relationship with the community, you have to have a community. It's a team sport, right? Games of life are always team sports. And so then the question is, well, where do you get the team? Are you a billionaire who can afford to just hire a bunch of people to be his team, right? Almost like the relationship between a billionaire and a professional football, team, right? That's kind of the path down which that simple great houses subsidy is going. Or do you have a team within your family, or do you have a team within your church? Do you find honorable people in some community and say, hey, we want to play games of life together, and that be the way that we frame ourselves? And I would also mention that in the kind of the Christian context, in the historical context, there is always this sort of minority. It's usually a fairly small minority, less than 1%, of people who have this experience where they're playing a game of life with God, right? These tend to be your monks, your kind of traveling ministers, the people that live by faith and not by sight, if you will. And it's a very useful frame to understand that's a game of life. But I think that the normative expression is not the normative expression of our lives, even for people that believe in the Christian story and would see that as their kind of faith allegiance. I don't think that for most people, your life is supposed to be a series of financial miracles. I think for most people, you're supposed to have relationships with other humans where you can reliably and predictably say to your wife, your children, your employees, the people in your world, here's how I have confidence that we're going to be able to put food on the table and meet some of those basic obligations. So I think that would be my initial opening statement. And then if you want to open it up for questions, or if you have something that you want clarified before we move on, that sounds great.
Yeah. Gentlemen, I'm intentionally not conducting an interview here. So Thomas, John, Daniel, Luke, Andy, go ahead and jump in with your questions or comments to guide the conversation.
I'll jump in here. Thanks, Greg, for, I guess, to get us started off with that. Following along with this conversation, I don't think that I need the convincing that the structure is a good idea. What I've been really curious about is, okay, what are these types of incentives and guardrails, and I guess coming through the thought process of having the right mission for these things to be successful. Because I think that a lot of the back and forth, our discussion has been, well, on the surface, giving money may or may not be good, and there are risks, and you've acknowledged that, and I've come across other sources acknowledging that. But what's our framework for making it beneficial? Whether that's education of the receivers, or, like I said, it's setting the appropriate mission statements, or other guardrails for setting these up.
Yeah, I mean, I think the first most basic guardrail is you want to limit as much as humanly possible money that doesn't have a purpose. Okay? You want a system or a plan or a budget, it doesn't really matter what you call it. You want some kind of sorting mechanism that when money comes in, you have a more or less automatic way of allocating it to several purposes, and you don't want to be having large amounts of money that you could do whatever you want with, because the tendency is going to be for humans is to spend it on whatever they feel like at that exact moment, which means you're not engaging in long-term thinking, you're not considering your long-term repercussions. If you have any kind of like bad emotional cycle or cope, things that you know need to cope for, people can very easily fall into, if they have money that doesn't have a purpose, they can very easily fall into this state of, oh, when I feel bad, I go spend money, or I go interact with this unpurposed box of financial stuff. So what you don't want is to start with all of the money being, quote, your money that you can do whatever you want with, and then every month you decide how much you're going to put into paying for your house, how much you're going to put into treating your wife, how much you're going to put aside for your kids' future, right? What you want is a system where you basically have an agreement with some other human that'll hold you accountable, whether that's your wife or an adult child or a mentor or some accountability partner of some kind, where you say, yeah, no, I mean, obviously the mortgage payment goes out, a certain percentage goes out to for maintenance for my house. Here's how much I spend on gas. Here's how much I spend on whatever these other things. And at the end of it, I have kind of a luxuries bucket. And that luxuries bucket is the only unpurposed money that I have in my life. And we set some pretty strong limits on how much is ever allowed to go in the luxuries bucket. Okay, so that's kind of the first point that I would make is you divide things between what are your necessities, what are you saving for the future, and what is your luxuries bucket. There's a great book called what's it? I mean, is the book called Pay Yourself First? I can't remember if that's actually the title, but there's a business book that has this concept of you pay yourself first. And you sort of decide, that means you set a limit of how much profit am I going to take home from the business. And then all of the other decisions that you make are serving that decision that you've already made. So you've set out, here is how much I'm going to pull out for my personal use. And I think pulling that money out of the business into the family, what you should do is do that again. Ideally, you have enough money that you say, well, I'm going to spend $1,000 a month on entertainment and movies and whatever, and that's enough for me. And everything else is sort of just money that you allocate to discrete purposes. Okay, so
the book is called Profit First by Michael Michalowicz. Profit First by Mike Michalowicz. Keep going.
Thank you so much, Joshua. That yeah. So you gotta just decide these things and have these sorting mechanisms. One of the things that we have learned is that making these large, big picture decisions about money where you're the person making the decision and you don't have any guidance, you don't have any system, is incredibly stressful for people just in and of itself. Just having money that you have to make decisions. If your normal luxuries budget is $1,000 a month, $12,000 a year, if you receive a $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 lump sum, and your response is, well, no, I'm just going to spend this on myself. It sends people into emotional spirals. So what I would say is never do that. Don't do that for yourself, and also don't do that for your children or for anybody that you're supporting. When you are giving them money, you want to have a clear expectation of what you're going to do with it, right, or what they're going to do with it. You want to have, and the easiest way for people to understand this is to treat it as a negotiation, whether it's in the context of a legally enforceable contract or not. If you say, hey, I'm giving you this money and my expectation is you're going to have kids with you and your wife as often as God allows, or whatever. If that's the value that your community is following, then that money has a clear purpose. and they have done something that they see as virtuous to earn it. Okay? That's what you want, and that's what you always want. And I think that there's a lot of people who are very uncomfortable about having these kinds of financial conversations with their children or with their friends. And if you're uncomfortable with having those financial conversations and understanding how the money works for them, or understanding if they have a budgeting system, well, what that means is that the relationship can't support the weight of the money that you're putting on it, right? So you think of relationships as these big steel cables that are going across a span, some distance, some chasm. And if those cables are good and strong, then you can put a bridge on top of it. You can put a lot of weight on top of it. You can drive a semi truck on top of it. If those things are weak, then you have a really difficult problem. Now, the great thing about human characteristics and human relationships is that you can work on them and they can get stronger over time. So this really does become the issue is if you're concerned about giving somebody $5,000 or even $50,000 and you have a lifetime nest egg of 5, 10, 20 million, it's extremely unwise to just put that off and give them one lump sum all at the end of their life, because there's two things happening there. One is you're making it happen in all one huge transaction. So you're putting all of the weight, instead of having a bunch of little cars go across your bridge over time, you're having one ginormous, semi truck carrying 10,000 tons of concrete try to drive across. That's a huge stress test. That's not advisable. And the second thing is, if you do it in the context of your death, then these people are going through this incredibly intense stress test of their ability to make good financial decisions while they're grieving. That's not what you want to do. I mean, and that's where people do they kind of fall down this rabbit hole of, well, I'm not going to give my kids any help or support during my life. And then they see some other people who didn't give their kids any help or support during their life, and therefore the muscles were weak, the cables were thin, and they see heirs shipwreck themselves on the money that their parents left them. And they decide, well, I guess I just can't give my kids any money at all because this is just destructive. And it's like, well, no. I mean, if you tell somebody, hey, you got to pick your husband up or your father up and carry him out of a burning building, and they are frankly a normal American, flabby, out of shape, unable to pick up heavy things, that's the likelihood is that they're going to fail, or they're going to hurt themselves. They're going to damage themselves in the process of carrying you out of that burning building. But if you can say, hey, at a certain point, you're going to have to pick up the weight, the gravitas that I've left behind and the money that comes along with that. And so I want you to start working on picking up little things. I don't need you to deadlift 300 pounds right now. And I don't want you to do nothing and then expect, well, somehow magically upon the moment of my father's passing, I'm going to be able to deadlift 350 pounds, even though I've put no work into it. That is not a good rational plan, but that doesn't have to be the plan. You can work at it. So any other questions? I do at some point want to get to that specific question that was asked in the chat about what do you do with the 5 million?
I'd like to just say that I think this is the core of what is so important for this group. As I've considered the discussion so we're building on a couple of assumptions. Number one, we're having a discussion among capable people who are able, with their efforts and with their time, and who are blessed with a system that is working to accumulate wealth. So in that context, once you're accumulating wealth, you basically have two pathways that you can go down. If you accumulate more wealth due to being a producer, not a taker, then you can either go down some hardcore pathway of hedonism, and hedonism could be expressed as spending large amounts of money on luxury consumption just to spend your money down. Hedonism could be expressed as stopping to work, stopping to produce, some form of early retirement, or you have to figure out how to profitably invest the money. And so because we don't have good cultural systems for recognizing that we need to help people build muscles, and that means that we need to give the money systematically and invest the money systematically long before death, then you wind up with me as a financial planner or a lawyer sitting in the office with somebody who's 70 years old and trying to work out his estate plan, and there's no clear process. So what I have taken away from our conversation at its core is that the skill of being able to suitably dispose of $5 million or $50 million or $5 billion when you are old and dying has to begin decades before, or at least years and years before, with intentional pathways.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good point. I would add that I think people don't appreciate the degree to which their children are already participating in a different mindset, because they're the children of these high capacity people. I think that the average IQ is 100. There's a lot in that statement. I think that the Pareto principle as applied to wealth is the most empirically demonstratable feature of our capitalist system, right? So when you understand that the average IQ is 100 and that the Pareto principle exists, you're going to have a moment of humility as a high capacity person, realizing that most likely most of your children are not going to be quite as high capacity as you. And one of the features of our reward system and our financial system is that we dramatically reward minute differences in extremes of capability, right? So the people that are in the top, fraction of 1% make not 10 times as much, but 100 times as much as people that are, in the top 2%, right? There is a incredible difference in how rewards work and how money works based on at the edges, relatively small differences in underlying capacity. So if your children return to the mean at all in any way, then there is a great deal of likelihood that their ability to build wealth, especially in terms of like going out and getting wage-based earnings in the marketplace, or starting a small business where they build, the primary product, at least initially, is their services. That sort of capacity is very unusual. There's a story in the Bible of Nebuchadnezzar, and I think Johann mentions this Johann Kurtz mentions this in one of his articles about meritocracy. There's a story of Nebuchadnezzar, going out and kind of surveying Babylon and saying, "Oh wow, look at all this stuff that I made. Look at this city, this Babylon that I have built with my own skill and talents." And God strikes him down, and he spends the next 7 years as a beast probably with Daniel in effect running the empire and holding it together for him. But I think that's a great danger of our current cultural moment and the way that we think about wealth and how we deserve the wealth that we have. And I think a much healthier frame is the one that was expressed by some folks in the chat, I think even including you, Joshua, that basically when you've had high levels of success, there is a real sense of, when you look at other people, that you have the sense of, wow, it's a miracle that I'm here. Right? There is it is, yes, I am high capacity. Yes, I worked really hard. But at the end of it all, there is an incredible blessing that the stars aligned and things opened for me, doors opened for me in ways that I didn't deserve and didn't earn. And my primary response to that should be gratitude. Well, and then there's a secondary response to that in the family context, which is realizing, hey, you had this as a first generation planner, as somebody that's a trailblazer, you had a bunch of experiences with God where God made a way for you when the human systems failed, when the patronage systems of the prior generation failed, where you blazed your own path. And that's wonderful. And you had God for that. Well, does God want your kids to likewise go out and for him to have to be intervening and doing in many ways these kind of miraculous things? Or does God want you to do that for your children, right? Does he want you to be a blessing? Or you're right, that classic idea of being blessed to be a blessing. So when we go through hard and difficult things, and when we accomplish dramatic things, I think the right frame to help keep you sane as an individual, but then there is this kind of secondary implication, is your family, and not just your family, but the people that you're discipling and the people in your world, they're going to look to you for those things, and I think that's good and natural. There's a line in A Model of Christian Charity, which you recently read on your podcast, and an excellent reading it was, sir, where he says, "Do not put God to the test by demanding that God miraculously provide for people in your community what he has already given to you for them." And I think that's just, it is not, that is an extremely countercultural idea, but I think it's a necessary one in our current moment.
Greg, I have a question going back to, sorry, this is kind of a stepping back to the death games versus life games principle you outlined. Is the idea you're suggesting that we could and should completely abolish death games so that nobody in the whole world has to play that? Or is it more that there will always be some people who are basically struggling against raw nature at great risk, and that's very challenging, and so ideally we want to see that only, the high, as much as possible, we minimize that death game struggle to the most high capacity individuals in our family or our society or our country or whatever it is, and we insulate those who are not yet able to bear that struggle from the death games, be that my 8-year-old children or my 18-year-old children or the just lower, less capable person who is my friend and employee or so on. Can you maybe clarify that a little?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the appropriate vehicle to play a death game in is a team, is an honorable team. And that if you're going to play, this is what we see in sort of, high functioning military teams, the Band of Brothers effect, which is that when you play a game where the admitted, obvious, explicit goal is to fight and potentially kill other people, the men in that community very much differentiate the relationships they have with each other from the relationships they have with the enemy. Right? There is a close, effectively familial bond there that enables them to say, well, I would, there's certain things that I would never do and never allow to be done to anyone that was in my unit. And I think that is a much healthier way to engage with a world that's full of risk and danger and uncertainty, is to say, hey, I need a team of people who I believe are basically honorable, and I don't think they're going to eat me, right? If I have to worry not just about will the team as a whole fail, if I have to worry about will the team eat me, will other people within this group that I'm having to cooperate with to survive, will some of them turn against me and not just put me in a position where I have less honor than they do, right? It's not just that they will win in some status game. Them winning and me losing will actually put me in a position where I can no longer feed my family. And that, the psychology of that is, I think, really destructive. And again, what it leads to in corporate contexts is when people think that's going to happen, they will break any rule of morality. Again, there is a statistically a fraction of people that is too small to show up in most statistical analysis that make a different choice for religious reasons. But as a society, as a population, we have to deal with the fact that if you think that the people that you're working alongside are likely to turn on you and put you in a position of the inability to meet your covenantal obligations, that kind of feels like a state of war. And that is not a healthy way to relate to people with whom you'd have to cooperate. And you get siloing. I mean, there was a famous case, I think it was General Electric, and it was a big products liability case, and it took like 7 years for the discovery to go in. And at the end of it, what they found out was that there was like 3 or 4 different siloed groups within General Electric that were actively sabotaging each other in the production of the particular project at issue, and nobody in the C-suite had any idea that was happening. And that's an extreme example, but the question is, what produces that, and does that have to be the default? And the answer is no. Like, that is produced by very destructive incentive structures. There's a great book called The Puritan Gift, which I would encourage you all to read, that talks about, among other things, the origin of General Electric and General Motors and kind of these, they call them the great engine companies of the first half of the 20th century. And they describe a organization structure that's very familiar to people that are familiar with like Presbyterian church polity, where you have these kind of intensive hierarchies at the bottom who then elect a high capacity person to go to a general assembly and represent them. And that's technically how GE was organized in its early days. And when it was organized that way, there was not this sort of destructive siloing and sabotaging. And that's how people behave when they don't see that there's a common bond between them. And so it's a very destructive way of interacting with the world when you can't have people around you that you trust not to stab you in the back.
So to kind of summarize that, what I'm hearing is that we should create a game of life around us, build that team, create that game of life around us so that together we can face the greater game of death that is the world around us.
Yeah, and again, I think the one of the things that's hinted at in the Christian story is maybe if enough people play games of life, and if enough games of life grow to a certain size, maybe something happens, maybe something magical happens, maybe some kind of eschaton breaks out. But yes, in the current kind of fallen world, what I would say is, my frame is, the bigger you can play, the bigger a game of life that you can join and play, the better. And you don't want to be playing a death game as an individual. That is an extremely bad, or even as a married couple, that is an extremely bad strategy. Right? I mean, there's a whole verse of, if one is alone and he falls down, something bad is going to happen to him. But if two are there, they fall down, the other one can pick them up. A cord of 3 strands is not easily broken. That is, so just just for context, in its initial context, that had nothing to do with marriage. That was about brotherhood and going from place to place by twos. Whether that was for you're a merchant, or in the early Christians used that as kind of their discipleship framework. Christ said that the 72 out by twos, and there's a lot of framing there of never go alone. Always have a buddy. Always have somebody that you're working with. And whenever you have that, one person in the buddy group is going to be smarter and have more capacity. And have more earning potential. That's just a fact, a reality, again, of how humans work. And so if you are not playing as an individual, you're playing as a team, and you want the team as a whole to win, because this is how you're triaging risk, right? So if you play as an individual, and if you ever lose, then you're done. You're out of the game. That's a bad strategy for playing what Simon Sinek would call the infinite game. But if you can join a group where you might lose an individual game, but then the group can recapitalize you or put more, inject more assets into your world, allow you to have access to certain things that can't be taken away from you as the penalty for losing. Well, then you can play in a lot more free way, and you won't there's always a price for that, right? So you're accepting some diminishment of the individual reward in the times that you win, because you're going to be recapitalized in the inevitable event that you as an individual suffer a loss. So losses no longer become catastrophic, world ending, frequently life ending. The amount of people who lose their job and find themselves in jeopardy, who have a crisis around suicide and these kinds of things is it's really dramatic. So I would say that framing it as it's always better to have a team around you, because life is hard. But yes, there is this really interesting concept in the Christian story that maybe if enough people played enough games of life, maybe that could change, or at least it could change for a family, and then for a church, and then for a town, and then for a city, and who knows how much that could scale up.
If there's no other immediate questions, I would like to hear your answer, Greg, to the question in the chat that you were alluding to before.
Yeah. So basically, the question in the chat was, if you have the $5 million nest egg and you're passing that on to your kids, how do you best have that impact their world, right? And one of the key things to start with is what is your strategy? What strategy do you want your kids to follow, right? Is your goal, hey, I think, oh son, that you should go out, you should get a good college degree, you're probably going to take on some student debt for that. You should get a corporate job with a reliable W-2 salary and buy a house with a mortgage, and you'll place some investments on the side with your excess income because your wages are going to keep up with your expenses, and that's the story. Well, then there really isn't any need for the $5 million if that's a good story. Or what you're going to do with the $5 million is you're going to spend it on taking the edge off of some of the big financial blocks that system puts in people's way. So your student loans, your mortgage, medical debts, maybe a car here or there, especially if there's a family. There's a huge and empirically demonstrated barrier to people having 3 children, in that they have to, because of the way that modern car seats are designed, in order to have 3 car seats, you frequently have to buy a much larger vehicle. And that has been, again, empirically shown to have prevented some absurd amount of births. So they actually did a study where they compared the amount of third children that people were willing to say, yeah, no, we didn't have a third child because of this policy, because of the cost. We couldn't figure out how to make it work. And they compared that to the amount of lives that are saved every year from having car seats, and the amount of births that were prevented by our modern safetyism mindset was 140 times the amount of lives that were saved by having these large car seats. So that's kind of option A, and that is the default option. That's kind of the American way. That's you saying, hey, we have a great country, we have a great system. I'm not worried about if my kid is a good, moral, virtuous kid and he works hard. He will be able to get out there and basically live life. And all that I'm concerned with my money is maybe easing his way, because maybe I think that student loans are a little bit too expensive, or maybe I think that mortgages are a little bit too high. But I don't want to. I don't want to really interfere with this path, because I think that's a basically good path. Okay, so that's option A. And if that's your position, then I think we've really got to ask the question of if giving an inheritance is of value to a kid in following that path at all, right? there's another path. And the other path would be to say, hey, I want my child to be able to play the game of life in a different way. I don't want them to go on the default American path. I want them to be able to think about unpaid internships. I want them to be able to serve in a church context, right? There's many families have as a custom that their kid do some kind of year or two of service in a church, even outside of like the Mormon context, right? There's a lot of good, solid Orthodox Christian families that say, yeah, I mean, that practice of sending your kid off to somewhere else to work at a ministry, during which time he is not maximizing his earning potential, is a really good idea for keeping that kid saved and sane and a virtuous member of our household and our family culture. But we understand that there's going to be a financial penalty, not just in the near term, but in the long term, right? Because the financial decisions that you make early in life really do compound over the length of your career. And there's less and less, kind of margin for forgiveness. So the way I would think about it is you can say, hey, I want you to gain some experience. And there's some period of time where you're not worried about monetizing. And then I want you to build something. And in order to build something, oh son of mine, you're going to need capital investment. And because you have no skills, you have no demonstrated career, no one in the traditional business world is going to give you money for that. So that's what the $5 million is for. It's to give, number one, the kid the ability, because if you can work unpaid internships, the doors that open up to you in terms of being able to get incredible access to high level networks, learn how things work, get trained by some of the elite people in our society is almost, it's hard to overstate how valuable the ability to say, for a year or two, I'm going to work at an unpaid internship, or I'm going to go to DC and participate in some kind of a political thing, or I'm going to go work with a church network and kind of see the world outside of the American context. Those things are really good for you. Okay. And then you come back and you've got a valuable skill. You know how to build something, but you have no experience. So you need a food truck or a taco truck for your first business, or you need to get a year-long lease on a Mai Tai dojo or something that you've got your skill. The best way to think about that 5 million is to think of it as a certain number of chances, of tries, to allow the kid to become an owner. Okay, there's a huge shift that happens when people become owners. And that's what that's how I would frame it, is we want to start with a couple of smaller tranches, right? $50,000. And again, you're not giving the kid $50,000 and saying he can spend it on whatever he wants. You're saying submit a business plan in line with these principles, and ideally aligned with the skills and experience that you picked up somewhere, right? So there's a good example of this would be a family that I knew that sent their kid to work on, they were a concrete family, but they sent their kid to work at this development site in Africa, worked with the local churches, connected with some of the NGOs that were doing things, and it was the typical NGO mess, as most of those places are. The state of philanthropy being what it is. But the kid learned about this really cool concrete technology that wasn't available. No one was doing it in the United States. And it wasn't that it was illegal. It was just different and new, and nobody had really tried it. They did have to kind of pull some connections to make sure that they could get stuff zoned. But that kid came back from that experience with the ability to say, wow, I know how this technology works. Now, he had to have the right mindset, right? That opportunity was not just sitting there, and no one nudged him to go. He had to say, well, I come from a concrete family, so we know concrete, and I'm going to learn about this because I know how this works, right? And when he got into it, he also had to have an actual mastery of how his family did things to realize, oh, wow, not only do I not know how to do this, I think certain aspects of this are better than what my family does, right? really, really radical shift. Okay. But functionally how that works in terms of like a trust or an inheritance perspective is you have a certain number of tranches. Think of them like grants. So when you're a student, $30,000 to $50,000 will pay for you to live anywhere in the world, basically, if you're a single person who's frugal and you dole it out to them on a monthly basis, and they're doing something, right? They're going to go on a mission. They're going to see the world. They're going to accomplish some really cool things. You say, hey, just understand, if you do drugs, if you do this, if you do that, the money is going to stop. Like, we will send you a plane ticket home and that's it, right? So you do have to put in some kind of rational boundaries there. The same as you would if you were a parent, right? If it was still your money and you were making that decision. But so you have, 2 to 3 tranches, 2 to 3 years of experience where you're saying, hey, I want you to go do something cool that gives you exposure to the way the world works, that's outside of our networks. Ideally, usually it's something that's sort of ideologically motivated. And if you can, we want you to work, but the experience, frankly, is more important. And you do have to write. You have to write it up, and you have to tell us what you've gained. But we're going to insulate you from the need to immediately go get a job. Okay, and that could be incredibly valuable. Then you have a couple more tranches of, hey, we're going to give you time to build a business, right? We want to say, okay, how do you, what business ideas are you interested in? What could you be an owner in? How could you exert leverage? Is there some fraction of time where, or is there some machine that we could buy you that would then allow you to engage in the business, whether that's on the retail side, the food truck, or whether it's machines that go in a warehouse? You very much want to have the kid see the money going into something else. Now, if you've got somebody that's mature, and especially after they get a wife and kids, entrepreneurial activity drops dramatically after you've got a wife and kids, because again, these kids don't know how, like, if they were to go do this crazy thing where there's no obvious way, they're not sure if they'll have cash flow for the first 3 years. They look at their wife and their wife says, well, how are we going to eat for the next 3 years? And if the answer is, I have no idea, probably that young man is not going to engage in that idea, even if that idea would be a really good long-term plan for him. Okay, and so again, the idea there would be, if possible, you don't even give the money to him. You give the money to his wife. You set him on a narrow time frame of, hey, son, you're going to be working really hard doing marketing, doing calls, doing whatever it is that you're doing. And what you would want to do if you're setting up an accountability mechanism for this is have the kid tell you how many calls he's going to make. If it's a sales thing, how many sales calls are you going to make? And if he stops dropping behind his numbers, you sit down and you say, hey, what's going on? Have we learned something different? Is this a deliberative change, or are you just tired? And if you're tired, well, go home to your wife and ask her if you want to do something else, because we don't want to be involved. We don't want to facilitate you sitting and feeling sorry for yourself, right? But you do have to have somebody that's watching that's mentoring, that's providing that alternative perspective. But you can get a bunch of businesses started with $100,000 of capital investment, right? And frankly, if the kid fails with the first investment, or the first couple investments, or maybe he builds something up and then he sells it and he breaks even, so he does something new. You really want that failure, that setback, to happen when it's small amounts of money, when it's these first simple small businesses where it's easy for the family resources to recapitalize the kid. Okay, and you don't want him to engage in risky behavior, obviously, but again, what you want is for him to be competing for honor. You want him to work really hard because he wants to tell you, Dad, I succeeded. Okay, Mom, I succeeded. Family legacy, I succeeded. If he is thinking, if I do what I'm supposed to do, then I'm not sitting here worried, because my experience is if you've got a guy that doesn't know how he's going to pay for his family, he's much more likely to sit at his desk and not get work done and just be paralyzed. And this happens in corporate contexts too, right? Especially in law firms. So you have these people that they don't know how to succeed, and so they just freeze, and that's a really bad thing. But you think of that $5 million as having a certain number of bullets. So you have the first couple of years, $30,000 to $50,000 for experience. You have some small businesses where we're going to inject $100,000 of capital for a machine or some equipment that you're going to use in the business, or potentially with the right kid and the right mindset, we're going to say, hey, if you're going to work really hard on something that isn't going to cash flow immediately, talk to us about what you need to bridge yourself between for 6 months or 12 months or 18 months or whatever it is to get this thing done, with the understanding that we're going to be checking in with you each month. And if you have stopped, then we're immediately going to reevaluate, right? And there can be off ramps. There can be saying, okay, now you've got to go get a job, and you've got a month or two to do that. We will continue. We're not going to cut you off immediately. We want you to be successful. We want you to be able to move into the next thing with grace. But after you go through that process of the experience and then the small businesses, that's when you want to say, okay, do we want to start to have a big capital outlay? So if you had a $5 million nest egg, and you had somebody that had gone through this process, so you've burned $500,000, given him the experience and given him the ability to the first couple of small businesses. And then you say, okay, there is this really cool opportunity to start drone manufacturing, something in the drone manufacturing space. But we need a factory that costs $2 million, right? That's where, hey, take the inheritance and move things forward. Say, if this is the right play and we've gotten the experience and this is the kind of thing that will allow someone to become an owner and be financially independent and really reap the main goal conceptually is you want him to be able to repay his family investment, right? If the drone business goes well, then what that kid is able to give back is so much more than everything that was invested in it, right? And that's really what you want. That's the only context in which you would invest the larger chunk, is when you say, okay, now this is an opportunity for you to repay maybe 10 times over everything that the family has invested in you. And that's really what drives hope and virtue in these things. That's what you want to be able to get to, is to say, hey, we're investing in you. We have invested in you. And it's not so that you can go off over there and work for somebody else and subject yourself to all the siphons that exist in modern life. It's so that you can build something that the family owns, and your lifetime achievement, right? Your lifetime earnings is much, much more. What you brought into the family is much more than what we've invested in you. And that's probably the base framework that I would give people. And if their thought is, well, this kid can't do that, right? Well, then maybe plan A is what he needs, right? Maybe plan A with some degree of insulation or some metric where it says, hey, you buy the house when you get it. When you get married, we're going to take the edge off of the mortgage payment for a while. When you have a kid, we're going to take the edge off the mortgage payment for a while, or we're going to help you buy the larger car if you say you're going to have a third kid, then you can apply to the trust for a car that complies with whatever regulations are enforced at the time, right? But those are what I see really as the two paths in terms of money. Now, there's a third path that is sort of building patronage networks in a social setting. And that's a wonderful thing to do, but it really is pretty low capital. So the capital of the family tends to not be terribly relevant. You can play this game with your church or with a fraternity or whatever social set, but you have to have the social set and you have to like them, and you have to have that group of people that are committed to playing games of honor or games of life. So I think that's all that I'd want to say in answer to that. Did I answer the question well enough for you guys? Any other questions on how I would see you leveraging that $5 million into a family that can support its own obligations?
Thomas, any follow-up to that? Go ahead, Thomas.
Yeah, I think that makes sense in giving the chances how to lay that out. I guess in terms of seeing whether or not the child wants to participate is simply just you make the offer, and whether they're game or not is decides whether they go for it initially, and then you have to constantly reevaluate that, as you said. I guess the way it ties to one of my other questions was how to how to really illustrate and incentivize the person that you think has the capability to perform well in that situation. How would you get them to see that as a better option versus because this person that's high capability would also be very successful in plan A, right? And
Yes.
they see that as a lower risk scenario because they've seen how it works. They've seen success in it. They have other stories. There's basically a proven model, and they're saying, well, why take a bigger risk to shoot higher when I know that I'll already end up in the top 5 percentile, right, or even top 2 percentile, right? I guess that's the question there.
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I think that the main reason is because more and more and more of our corporate contexts are very obviously death games. So if you have the opportunity to work at a blue chip law firm level, those blue chip lawyers spend all of their time, and a shocking amount of, not all of their time, but a shocking amount of time, and a shocking amount, frankly, of time that the clients have paid for scheming against each other, right? That there's a lot of things that are unrealistic about the Suits TV show, but the thing that I think is actually the amount of time that they spend going back and forth at each other. And I would actually say that the way that the team in Suits is kind of this family, and they look out for each other even though they have their tiffs, that's pretty unusual in my experience. Most high-level law firms and most high-level corporate gigs are very, very cutthroat and increasingly cutthroat. And I think a lot of it is just what kind of life do you want to build? I had the opportunity in my time to go and participate in that and be very, very well compensated for that in terms of my wages and an opportunity to participate in the firms. And I looked at those men, and they were all on their second or third wife, and none of them had what I would consider healthy relationships with their children. Many of them had no children. And that was not the kind of society that I wanted to imitate. That was not the kind of path that I wanted to walk on. And I, maybe rightly or wrongly, I believe that I could have done that. And I did that for a period of time. I had kind of a probationary setup period of time at a Dallas litigation firm. it was a small one, but I was exposed to those larger teams and those larger firms, and what just struck me was how frightened all of the people in those systems were of the other people that allegedly worked for their firm. There was no loyalty, there was no faith, there was obviously a due attendance to the ethical rules. But yeah, the if you are in that top percentile, you absolutely can go out and win in that environment and hang with the sharks. But most people that do that become sharks, right? And so I think the question is, do I want to be a shark? Do I want to be a wolf? Or do I want to be a sheepdog? And if I want to be a sheepdog, then I got to have people that I'm protecting and loyal to, right? And that's very difficult to achieve in the corporate context. And even when you do achieve it, it's incredibly fragile. It can get taken away from you at any time. And there's very little recourse when it does get taken away from you. And, of such things are employment lawsuits made. But yeah, we have to be very straightforward of, yes, there is another path for these high capacity people. And if they decide to go that direction, then more power to them. But my thing is, I think even as a top level player, why would I want to play a death game if I could play a game of life? That's really what you got to ask yourself is what kinds of games do we want to play? And maybe there is a time, like for many people, there is a time and a place to go out there in your early 20s. I wouldn't really advise being married for this process, but let's say you go out there and you kill it from 22 when you graduate college, you take your master's degree while you're working, and by 35 you are financially independent, right? That's not a great plan, but it is a plan and it works. But I think that more and more, this is true now, and it's increasingly true. The more that you play that game, the longer it's taking, and the harder it is on families. And again, there are men that just gut it out as a single man, and then they marry usually a much younger woman if they want to have any significant amount of children. And I have an enormous amount of respect for that path. The overwhelming majority of men that have done that, when I kind of compare notes and ask them how it's going, they express something to the effect to me of, wow, I wish my life looked more like Andy's or mine, right? They'll express a desire for a lifestyle that is not that path. So there's a lot of buyer's remorse down that road in my again anecdotal experience.
I have a lot of themes here that I think we could explore, but I'd like to make sure that Daniel and Luke, you guys haven't jumped in yet. Why don't one of you jump in with a question or comment to go down next?
Sure. So I appreciate the conversation we've been able to have on the group chat, Greg. It's been wild back and forth, and I've loved it. So context, again, I grew up with independence as a very high value. I'm from the Midwest. We live out on the range. That's our dream as a family is to go build a homestead, right? I'm trying to reconcile that with the patronage discussion, especially. The form of patronage that you're presenting, where it's very much rewarding specific courses of action, bothers me less than the one that was originally in the article, where it was just a cash gift of $5,000 or $6,000 a month, as long as you're aiming towards these things. But I'm still worried that it will form a pattern of dependence on the patron, something that would be, in practice, more like welfare or more like economic outpatient care from Tom Stanley's book, where it weakens the recipient. So he's not motivated to go win in the death games, as you termed it. He's not motivated to develop those skills and succeed. I find successful people very attractive if they're able to go accomplish things through the sweat of their brow and their wisdom, obviously interacting with other people in positive reciprocal relationships, but the ability to build something is extremely attractive to me. I'm worried that patronage would disincentivize that. So I'm hoping you could speak to that. I know we've talked some in the chat, but hoping you could speak to that for me and for people like me who heard the patronage discussion that Joshua originally posted and had that sort of gut reaction where we could see how we could get to the point of being a patron. The thing would be offering to the clients wasn't something that we would want for ourselves. We wouldn't want to put ourselves in that dependent situation on one person. I'm hoping you could speak to that, and I'm not going to rehash the whole discussion here that we had in Telegram, but hoping you could speak to that, please.
Yeah, no, thanks, Luke. And I mean, I was expressing with Joshua, I think you were actually there on the call. This has been an enormously productive. I think I've written, 10, 12,000 words in many cases responding to you. And I find that enormously productive and helpful. And so thank you for being such an excellent questioner. You asked questions that I want to be able to answer. And I think what I would say is, number one, I grew up on a ranch. A dairy farm, but I grew up in ranch culture, and I don't think of it as like, I don't think that depending on other men of honor makes you dependent in the negative sense. And yet everyone in the ranch, there was 3 or 4 people without which my grandfather's ranch could not have operated. And again, I don't know, I haven't ever worked on one of the big ranches like they have out in the Midwest or in Nevada, these huge ranches. But my sense is that there is this deep camaraderie, there is this deep loyalty, and there is economically speaking, I'm going to tell you that you can't do it without the landowner, you can't do it without the foreman, you can't do it without the hands, right? You can't, like, there's a number of people who have to cooperate virtuously, and they all need each other. And so that's a form of dependence, but it's not a bad form of dependence. And yeah, I mean, all those guys are in some sense ultimately dependent on the landowner. But cowboys are the most independent humans in America today. So whatever is happening that creates these forms of dependence doesn't happen in virtuous working teams of men that are interacting with the real world, right? Like that's my experience, and that's sort of why I think I have a disconnect, because I just don't. There's very obviously, I was raised around a very obvious team-based structure where my grandfather promised the hands and his children a certain standard of living. And he always delivered on that. And he delivered on that. It just really wasn't related to the economic output that individual hand gave him, right? So that's what I've seen. And to me, that was the best possible life. I'm trying to get back to that. I'm trying to get back to that, to what I see as the real way, the economic function of the way a ranch works, which I would see as a system, not at all an individualistic system, because you all need each other, but it does create people that the best kind of individuals are people who, for the sake of honor, because they're a cowboy, because they're a man, they want to work hard, work well for their peers. Even though in some senses there's a bunch of things that going on there that in any other context we would say, well, that's creating dependence, but it doesn't, right? So there's something else going on with the economic outpatient care that is not about providing housing and not about providing, schooling for the kids and all of those things. Because my grandfather did all those things, and I assure you, none of the cowboys, none of the hands were dependent men. That's not how that worked. So I think there's a larger frame of if you tell someone that there is no game of death happening, that life is that there is not dramatic, dangerous challenges, then they are living in a lie. Okay, I think one of the reasons why people that work with the land, that work with animals, don't have these negative outcomes is because if you startle a herd of cows and they charge, right, there's a very real possibility you're going to die in the next 10 seconds, right? And that brush with death, right, is very real, very potent. And you have to contend with that you are in a death game in some sense. You are playing a game for which the stakes are everything you have. The question is, if you as an individual fall, do you fail? Right? And that's the critical differentiator. Like if you're, and I've known farmers, right, who worked their land by themselves, and when they died, they dropped in their field, and maybe their wife found them, or maybe their kids found them, a couple days later, or even a week later, right? And when they fell, everything that depended on them fell with it, right? Whatever churches they supported, whatever ministries they supported, it all ends. But that's not what was going to happen on my grandfather's ranch, right? If an individual hand, even if he made a mistake, frankly, broke his leg or broke his back, as happened one time, if he was out there in the open markets, working as a day laborer, if he breaks his back, he's done. And even working for most corporations, most construction companies, he's done. Maybe you get some workman's comp, but that's not how my grandfather operated. And because of that, his hands would have died for him because of that. And I think that's what we're all trying to get back to. That's my model. That's my frame for the game of honor. So, and this is what I see in families that are successful, is they don't insulate their children from the idea that there is a death game. They don't insulate their children from the idea that there is a very high stakes, very dangerous game. And if we mess up, then there will be consequences. But they don't. What they tell their children is, you're not playing that death game alone. And especially whatever games we play within our family are never, ever to be death games. We do not, we don't draw knives against family, right? We might fight with fists, okay? We might hit each other. We might drag each other through the mud, but you never draw a knife against family, okay? You never have war to the knife within the circle. And now that doesn't mean that there isn't war to the knife going on. We are, the war is all around us, and we have to kind of contend with a world for which most spiritual traditions say war is an excellent metaphor for what's going on out there. But you don't have to fight that alone. And that's the real shift, right? If what you do with your money is try to tell your children, well, you can just live a nice life and you don't have to fight the war. You don't have to fight. And I would say, some of those who know me a little bit better, I have a frame for covenant. And the way that I think people get wealthy is by entering into a covenant with God to accomplish some purpose or guard some point, right? To ensure that a certain piece of God's good creation is organized and operating according to his rules. And if you send your children out and you say, you don't have to guard the thing that God told me to guard, that's a disservice to your family and your children, and it will ruin your kids. That being cut off from the real purpose, from the real story of what makes your family go round, that is incredibly destructive. So that is what I would see as the outcome. Sorry, go ahead.
No, finish up. Go ahead.
So that is what I would see as the root cause of the negatives of the economic outpatient. And then just sort of the general, if you give somebody money without a purpose and say, do whatever makes you feel happy, then they're going to spend it on things that are very short term. And frequently that leads to addictive behavior, poor coping mechanisms, and it's not long-term behavior, right? So that's the problem.
I think as I flipped through again Millionaire Next Door last night and looked carefully at the economic outpatient care discussion, and I don't want us to get into the weeds of a debate here, but as I tried to synthesize these perspectives, because I think Luke's perspective is certainly valid, I come back to the weakness of measuring money as a criteria of success and how that plays into an overall family's vision. So money is easy to measure, but just because it's easy to measure doesn't mean that that's the metric that we should primarily be focusing on. And of course, Tom Stanley's research on this topic is primarily focused on money, at least the statistical research. But if I think of myself as the father and patriarch of a family, I think we should incorporate the value of specialization of labor. One of my thoughts about patronage is that in the modern American system, where we engage in highly individualistic thinking and behavior on a family perspective, we basically require every person to go down the same pathway instead of allowing for a specialization of labor. And one comment that, Greg, you made earlier was how those who are at the very highest, the number one performer in any particular professional sport earns massively more than the number 4 performer in that sport or in business, things like that. And so I think that it is helpful to think of making money as a specialized skill that if there were strong family relationships and if somebody within that or strong family or social relationships, because we can look at a broader patronage network. And if somebody has succeeded at a very high level of making money, now the money needs for that network are met. That can free up other members of the network to then go and focus on their areas of specialty. And so if we make everything measured with money as the primary factor, of course, we're going to recognize that when someone walks away from the money game and pursues another game, they're getting a less effective output. My wife, as a full-time mother, walked away from the money game. Our family would probably have more money if she were playing the money game, but we have more children because she doesn't play the money game. And so if the entire point was to win the money game, then we made the wrong decision. But the holistic game is the thing that is necessary. So if we recognize that, let's say we have a network of people and there's 10 of us who are broadly aligned and we are a culture of honor and we're working together, and we look at the world and we say, you know what? 2 of us or 1 of us is very skilled with making money, has great business skills. Another one is very skilled in something related to that. What if the 2 of us focus on creating the funds to run things for the rest of us? And then one of us seems particularly skilled with politics, so let's go into politics. One of us seems particularly skilled with ministry, so let's let that person go into ministry. One of us is very particularly skilled in artistic production, so let that person go there. Then within our network, we would have the benefits of a specialization of labor economy within our network, assuming that we can maintain personal trust and commitment to the mission. And what I think about, I'll just give a specific example here that I observed in the last election. There was a man in the last election who was a conservative political activist on the right-wing side named Scott Pressler. And from my perspective, at least as far as I know, Scott Pressler, prior to the 2024 presidential election and his work in the years prior to that, he didn't have much of a career, much of anything. But he became a political activist, and the thing that brought him to public notoriety was his work registering voters in the state of Pennsylvania. He had a theory that if he could register enough voters in the state of Pennsylvania who would vote for candidate Trump, then his preferred candidate, Donald Trump, would win. Now, after the election, his efforts at registering those candidates were very effective. And what I observed was here was a man with no political connections, no political capital, who invested a few years of his life into something that really anybody could have done, but he invested a few years of his life into something, and he did it for a man with political power who is highly transactional. I don't know what Scott Presler did with that power, but he pretty well could have gone to the Trump administration and asked for not almost anything, but many different things. And because he had demonstrated loyalty to President Trump, who was a transactional man, he would have been rewarded, or probably has been rewarded, with various connections to power. But in order for him to do that, it was necessary for him to invest several years of his life into this particular activity. And that really opened my eyes, because especially with my tradition, and I don't align broadly with many things that Scott Presler would stand for, but in my political leanings, generally speaking, people with my political instincts tend to be ineffective because we don't want to do things like Presler did. We don't want to actually invest several years of our lives into something in order to gain favor with a politician who can then grant a measure of power. And I'm not necessarily advocating that that's what I want to do, but as a thought experiment, it demonstrates that, let's pretend that I were now a patron and I had a young 24-year-old client who is open to my direction. I said to this client, listen, it would be extremely valuable for our network to have increasing amounts of political power. And here is a strategic way in which we could curry that access to power if you were to invest your time in this area. And you are a high capacity person who is well capable of going into business, making lots of money at this time in your life. But all those skills that make you high capacity in the money making space also would make you high capacity in the political space. So what I would like you to do is, I've got the money. I would like to provide I would like to support your family so that you don't feel like you're harming your wife and children, and I'd like you to invest several years of your life in this particular area. I know I've chosen kind of a charged example, but I think it's a real example. I could list right now a dozen areas in which, if we could just take one high capacity person who is capable of becoming fully independent and going and earning $1 million a year so that his wife and children are in comfort and ease and luxury, and instead said, listen, we'll see to the financial need because we really need someone of your ability to focus on this particular problem that society needs help with, or this particular issue within our local town, then now, yes, that person will be less productive because of that. Financially productive. That person will be less financially productive because he is turning away from money making as the primary goal. And yet our society will be much better off because of that. And my final comment is simply that this is, to me, the tragedy of what I now see in the United States of America. We have broadly glorified money making and money accumulation as a worthy end in itself. And so our wealthy people in our culture have no idea what to do with it. Now, I don't know if it actually was better in the past in other cultures, or if I'm just committing a golden era fallacy of analysis. But when I look at a beautiful building in a town square of some ancient historic city, or I look at a beautiful cathedral, or I observe a beautiful work of art, I long for wealthy Americans to once again gain a sense of contribution to society that goes far beyond just making money and stacking it up. I long for them to recognize that with this great wealth comes responsibility to my neighbor to actually fix things and to patronize people who can do those things. And so whether it's just simply a beautiful building at the center of a town, or whether it's a new technology, or whether it's arts, that's not my business to say. But broadly speaking, I think we've lost this perspective of valuing these civic duties that we have one towards another in favor of the individual accumulation of money.
Yeah, and the individual accumulation of money in wage earning contexts, which are taxed at the highest rate. My final comment is, I think that we don't have good visibility of people that are still doing this process, because just to use the example of somebody that makes $60K a year and lives in a $300,000 house. If someone was receiving economic outpatient care, that's what that looks like. If someone was engaged, if they had a tax lawyer that was saying, well, what we want you to do is have 5 years of your life be devoted, or 10 years or 20 years of your life. This happens frequently in like firefighters, civil service context. There's kind of a firefighter to construction pipeline. So you have a son of the house that goes and works for the fire department for 10, 15, 20 years. And during that time, he doesn't really make very much money. Okay. But after that time, over this arc of his life, he knows every building in the city. He knows all of the builders. He has a deep and intimate knowledge of safety and all of these things. And he has connections and relationships with all of the key people in the city. So he can then, in his later years, go back to his family and genuinely generate all, not just all the money that was spent in him, but 10, 100, sometimes 1,000 times that much money. But if it's properly structured, you will never see those assets or that money appear on his balance sheet, because ideally that value is going to be created in a better tax vehicle, some kind of trust structure or something that is separate from the individual operators of the family. They'll receive enough money to live on and access to this growing capital pod, but it won't appear on their direct financial balance sheets. And there was a question somebody had asked in the chat about trusts. So I think that's how this interacts. That's how the game is played. So if someone is playing the game the right way, they're still gonna look on paper like the person making 60 grand who lives in a $300,000 house. So don't always be fooled by the way that those things are organized. Because there is a real benefit, and again, there's a real financial benefit to having that money be in a special purpose vehicle. So this is not just something that exists at the super high political levels. It exists down to the levels of any ordinary town that you live in. Anybody can play this game, but you can't play those games if what you say is, okay, kids, we'll go out and every month you've got to bring in more money each month than you spend. And that's the game that I want you to play. And when you've demonstrated that every single month you're bringing in enough money to fund your lifestyle, then we can talk about other things. That's just a very short-term view. And if you have a short-term view, it's really hard to make the big amounts of money long-term.
Yeah. We'll start to head towards winding down here. I think we've got time for one or two more questions. Gentlemen, you want to jump in with something else? Daniel, you have anything to add? Otherwise, I've got one more comment to make.
I guess not directly. It's ancillary, but related. And Greg, thanks for kind of breaking down the education and like money piece, because I think that's helpful to kind of, these are ways, especially for younger men or kids, how to deal with it. And I'll say, like, my parents never had a ton of money to give to us, but one way they kind of exhibited what they could was both my brother and I did live at home during going to college. And so that turned, we were both able to get scholarships. And so we were able to not take on any debt, which there are so many people that just kind of force their kids for the college experience into staying on campus, et cetera. Right. And I know people who bought, a duplex for their kids to live in and kind of did that kind of thing. But I guess maybe this would be easier to go into at a different time or in a different way. But you mentioned like God giving you your piece of creation to improve and to defend. Do you have any resources on kind of how to delve into that for yourself? I said, and like I said, Joshua and I talked about this a lot, and so have Andy and I. I think some people can come to that, what they feel like that thing is for them fairly easily. That is not I don't. I've done many of the exercises Joshua recommends, and lots of different ones, and I've never quite come to, oh, I feel really confident and this is where God would have me do my thing. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think I touched on this in the chat at some point, I feel like, but for many people, I would say even probably a majority of people, they don't have a calling about creation. They have an assignment to a person. And obviously you have to, like, the difficult thing about that is our culture does not give us any of the training wheels or any of the cultural experiences that help people to evaluate a potential patron, or any of, like the legal protections that would be traditionally associated with a feudal lord, or his feudal retainers. We have really made that much more difficult than it has to be. But I do think that probably I just off the top of my head, I'd guess 60, 70, 80% of the people in the world, the way that they think about calling is going to be, they see calling in someone else and say, wow, that's a thing that I want. And the way that they're going to get access to that calling, the way they're going to be able to participate in the amazing things that are happening there, is by being involved in that person's world and helping them accomplish the great and mighty goal that they're articulating. I think that's going to be, the overwhelming majority of people. And that's good and necessary, because people have to build those teams, right? And that's not even to say that you can't be a client or you can't be a patron, and have a patron mindset without a calling. You have to have access to a calling. You have to have, if you don't see that you have a specific calling in yourself, the fastest way to become a patron is to find a patron and say, hey, I want to become your client so that I can be a patron to others. I want you to disciple me. I want you to resource me so that I can resource and disciple others. And that is, I mean, that really gets into kind of the Christian discipleship movements and kind of the secondary game that Christians play. But that's how I would frame that. And that's what I would look for, is say, who are you assigned to? And the other thing is one of the big objections that immediately pops up, well, what happens if that person goes off the rails? Okay. What happens if that person doesn't do what they're supposed to do, right? Then if they don't do what they're supposed to do, then another word for what's happening is they are forfeiting their calling, okay? And that means that someone else in the group, in that team of people, is going to need to pick up that calling. And that means either there's two possibilities. Someone else in the group who loves that calling is going to pick it up and charge forward. And maybe you can go along with that person, right? Or maybe it's you. Maybe you find your calling by serving faithfully alongside someone who sees it clearly. And if something happens to them, whether they die or they disqualify themselves or they apostatize or whatever, all of these things happen. People abandon their callings all the time. Then maybe if you love that calling, if you want those truths to be present in our world, maybe that's how you acquire the knowledge of what it is that you're called to do. So that's that. There's so much more that could be said about that, but I do think that's an important point to touch on as we close out.
That's right. You did mention that. Thanks.
All right, last call. Anybody else? Greg, this has inspired for me a lot of thoughts. It's not only the conversation here today, of course, this is in the context of 75-page conversation, but I think that I just want to tell you, please keep on talking about this. So I think that this has certainly expanded my mind significantly And especially in our current moment, at least in the United States, maybe it's happening in other places due to global trends, but at least in the United States, these discussions we are having and will have in the future, especially with practical ideas to exercise skills of patronage, exercise skills as clients, practice within our families, and to build broader networks. This is truly a very productive thing. And we could list dozens of areas that we need these networks focused on, to say nothing of just simply the towns that we live in and the common weal within them. So I just want to thank you for expanding my mind, and I want to continue the conversation. Go ahead and share any final closing thoughts you have of what we've talked about here, and we'll shut it down.
All right. Well, just thank you so much, and it's really been, as I said, I think earlier, an incredible pleasure to engage with high capacity people in a sustained way on this topic. So, and that's been almost unique in my experience. So, thank you so much, and thank you to everyone on the call and everyone in the community.
Excellent. Thanks everyone for coming. Talk with you soon.